Ladies and gentlemen, playing a really solid defense in Valorant is one of the most important things that you need to do if you want to climb the ranked environment. You see, in defense, there's so many different decisions and things that can happen that you need to be prepared for. Maybe the enemy rushes you all at once, 5-person in the site that you're just holding by yourself. Maybe there's several people attacking one of the sites and you don't know if you should hold your position or rotate around either through a flank or back through your spawn. Knowing the answers and how to play every single one of these scenarios is incredibly important, so let's break it down in this video. And if you like Valorant content, do me a huge favor, smash that sub button. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it, shall we? So the first thing that you need to do before anything else on defense is pick your site. Now, what site you pick when you're playing defense will be dependent on the map, how many players are on each site, whether you're stacking it or if you're solo, and what character you are. Some characters are naturally better at playing certain sites, and it really depends on your team composition as a whole and your individual kit, but simply let's talk about your kit. So sites, particularly with choke points, you want to be playing a character that can easily capitalize on the fact that the enemies have to route through such a small choke point. Think about a character like Sage or Raze. These characters can easily punish these choke points, so you almost always want to have them stacked there in order to get easier value and potentially stop the enemy. Now, points with longer sight lines, you typically want to get an information gatherer on one of these sites, someone like Cypher or Sova, because they can use their information to get sight on the long sight lines without potentially having to peek it themselves and get shut down. Now, closer range sites or closer range peek angles with easy access to the enemy, making flank plays, or even fighting people from closer ranges. You probably want a dueler or initiator in one of these zones so that you can get full advantage of your flashes, someone like Breach, someone like Phoenix, or even fraggers like Omen and Jet. Now, next up, the most important thing that you need to do when someone pushes onto your site. You're playing a site and you get rushed by multiple members of the enemy team. They want to get on the site and plant, and that is the nightmare scenario. You do not want to allow them to do that, so what do? Well, the thing that you need to do more than anything is try to delay the enemy. If the enemy wants to rush on without playing neutral, without baiting any utility, then you should be using your utility to delay them. This can be used in multiple ways. You can block off LOS and punish enemies for coming in. You can potentially ice them off, molly them off, or use all sorts of utility to prevent them from pushing onto point. The idea here is that you give your teammates time so that if the full enemy pushes onto the point, at the very least, they didn't just push onto point, kill you, and then take the point over. Not only do you leave your teammates in a 4v5, but you also didn't stall them in any meaningful way, and you didn't trade out in a meaningful way, which is incredibly problematic. Do not die at all without delay, without using your utility. That is a nightmare scenario. Now, the next thing that you need to do is you need to relay perfect information. This is a huge mistake that definitely plagues a lot of the players in this game, and it really comes down to calling who's there. I can't tell you how many times players have said everyone on this site. They say everyone's here when they only see like 3 people, and then someone wants to flank around or make a play on the enemy, and they get killed in mid when you said that they were all on one site. You need to be only calling the perfect information that you know, and don't assume anything to be true unless you absolutely know it. This is really important to get shot calling on point because you definitely need to have your team make plays on the enemy, especially if they're all pushing in. You need to make sure that your teammates can run and rotate incredibly quickly, but you also got to make sure that you get this call correct. Now, the next thing you need to think about, especially when you're thinking about how you play your site, is effective range. If you are in a price tier far above the enemy team and you know that your effective range, the range on your gun, its lethality range is far longer than theirs, then you can hold incredibly differently. For example, if you have an op and the enemy only has SMGs, then you can just hard scope down long. Even if they don't have SMGs, they have rifles, hard scoping down long when you get the angle first is incredibly effective. On top of that, you need to be playing in a different way if you know that the enemy has longer effective range than you. If you do not have the capability of challenging people in long sight lines, then you need to be using your LOS and hiding somewhere on the point so that you can punish enemies for pushing onto the point and not swinging through every single corner. This means using natural cover LOS and your abilities to set up a scenario where you get into the effective range of the enemy, even if they have a sniper or an assault rifle and you only have something like a shotgun or a pistol. Now, the next important thing about sight holding comes down to what characters you're playing. If you're playing a character like Cypher or even a fragger like Raze or anything like that, mix-ups can bring a lot of value. I definitely need to talk about mix-ups here because it doesn't happen that often, even though it could be a lot of potential value. Let me give you this example and break down what I mean. So a Cypher, for example, is a character that is dominant to play against sometimes. not a lot of teams want to push aggressively into a Cypher because they know that a Cypher could potentially set up a play where he gets perfect information on you, sets you up in a trap, and you get punished essentially for free. And dying without trading out is a nightmare scenario, especially if you get out safely and then you can retake the point as a 5v4 or even better than that. So oftentimes, if you keep playing the same site, teams will never play into you. They'll play into you once, they find out that that's the site you're playing into, and then they'll never go that site again. They think, why would I waste all my time and effort pushing into a Cypher and all of his traps, and instead push another site, and he wastes all of his utility on the first site. And even if you want to pick up some of your abilities, you can't pick them all up because you can't pick up your Cypher cages, or you won't have enough time to pick up everything. So what you want to do typically, instead of playing the same site over and over and over again, is you really want to be playing every single possible site and mixing it up in different ways. Sometimes you want to be playing your C site or whatever long sideline on Cypher because that's the way you're most effective. But then later on in the game, especially if you notice that they're not pushing into you that much, mix it up. Try it on one side, move to the other side. Because this type of utility, or the utility of even other characters, can bring up a certain amount of unpredictable value, and it can make them play into you when they start expecting you to play the same site over and over again. So you can go into comms and say, hey, let's mix it up for this round. I think the enemy thinks I always play here, so I want to bait them with my trap, or anything like that, and you can easily get a lot of value just from the element of surprise. Now, the next big thing we got to talk about is rotations and flanking. So a big problem that happens very often is players rotate far too early. If an enemy team is just playing in default, the area before they push onto point, and they're simply just firing away, trying to bait out utility, that is not the green light to rotate. Oftentimes, if you rotate too soon, the enemy will counter-rotate onto the point, and you'll give it up for free, which also puts your teammates in a huge disadvantage. What you need to be doing is playing your site until you get the actual go-ahead that they're pushing onto point. It's up to your teammates to not just instantly die, and hopefully they don't, but even if they do, it's still going to be your fault if you leave the site too soon and the enemy counter-rotate onto your point, you give it up for free. Now, something that could come up is flanking, and flanking is an incredibly powerful strategy, especially on the map Haven, where there's 3 points. Flanking can get a lot of value, but there is a stipulation to that, and it depends on 1, the character you are, and 2, the consistency that you flank. So some characters flank a lot better. Characters like Reyna, characters like Phoenix, characters like Breach. These characters all have stuns, allowing you to take unfair duels with the enemy, and that is incredibly powerful for flanking. Now, the thing about flanking is if you become predictable with your flanks, if you do it too aggressively or too much or too often or whatever, then you can easily get shut down by enemies waiting for you. You're pushing away from your point, out of your comfort zone, into the backline, where you could potentially get waited out and baited by enemies. The thing about flanking is it's far better to do when you know that the enemies are full committing to a site, but keep in mind that enemies can always be baiting you or waiting you out. So definitely you can incorporate it if you're some of these really powerful flanking heroes, but don't just flank all the time 24/7. Now, before we end it, let's give you some huge tips and takeaways that you can start applying to your game right away. So the big thing that you need to notice right off the bat is rush pushes, and you need to notice them right away. You can't afford to delay. If you know that 4 or 5 people on the enemy team is rushing you, do not stand your ground. Use utility and back the heck up. You do not want to face tank multiple enemies and get swung on. The best you could do in that scenario is get maybe 1 kill, but you're not going to be able to kill the entire enemy team unless the enemy is bad. So really notice rush pushes, and keep in mind, especially when enemies are on pistol round, they're way more likely to rush push. Now, the next rule I already talked about, but I have to reiterate it here. Do not give up your life without at least delay or using some sort of utility. Now, the next thing you need to think about is mix up your positions depending on your character. We talked about this. It's a very important lesson to take home from this video. And then lastly, play differently around certain characters. And this is not a topic that we talked about that much already, but that's something that you need to keep in mind. You cannot be playing these close sightlines if you know that the Breach consistently checks it out with utility. You cannot be trapping yourself in a tight corridor if you know that the Raze constantly throws pain shells there. Just keep in mind the habits and what a character can do, and that will definitely tell you how you can play a site and how you should change up your play and adapt mid-round. Anyways, if you learned anything from this video, do me a huge solid, smash that sub button, and I want to know in the comments down below, what are some other god tips that you have for defense in Valorant so the community can learn from your valuable insight. Anyways, any other video suggestions or ideas that you want to see, definitely let me know in the comments down below. That's all we got for you today. I'm Coach Mills, and until next time,